My brother burned every childhood photo of me. Grandma had hidden the originals. I knew my brother had burned every childhood photograph of me when I found a blackened silver corner from our family album floating in Grandma June's birdbath. I remember the moment clearly because humiliation sharpens ordinary details. The room, the light, and the expressions around me all became fixed in memory. What looked small to everyone else felt like a verdict on who I was allowed to become. I did not have the language to challenge that verdict yet, so I watched, listened, and stored the truth. Caleb had not destroyed clutter. He had tried to remove visible proof that I belonged. The fire pit behind our mother's house was still warm, and melted plastic clung to the stones where 3 storage boxes had been emptied. I wrote the information down before speaking to anyone. That habit protected me from the subtle revisions that followed every confrontation. When a date later shifted, or a promise became a misunderstanding, I could return to what had actually happened. The record did not make the situation less painful, but it prevented pain from being used to erase precision. I returned to photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records whenever pressure tried to blur what had happened. That discipline moved me closer to preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. Our mother had died 6 weeks earlier, leaving a house full of grief and a trust neither of us had read completely. That detail mattered more than it seemed. In my family and in every institution surrounding us, appearances were often accepted before facts. Once a convenient version of me had been repeated, people treated my reaction as the problem and the original cruelty as background noise. I began learning that silence protects the person who controls the story, not the person trying to survive it. I had been caring for Mom through her last year, but exhaustion made me slow to challenge him. Caleb became executor under an older document and treated the role like ownership, changing locks and deciding which memories each relative deserved. The practical effect reached beyond that day. It changed where I lived, how I worked, and which relationships felt safe. I became more careful without becoming cold. Caution and bitterness are not the same thing. Caution asks for consistency before trust expands. Bitterness assumes consistency is impossible. I wanted a life built on the first, not imprisoned by the second. The clearest protection remained in photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records, where confidence could not rewrite sequence. It was one more quiet step toward preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. He claimed the photographs were mold damaged and unsafe to keep. I did not respond dramatically. Years of being underestimated had taught me that anger was easiest to dismiss when it arrived before evidence. Instead, I noticed dates, names, and the order in which people changed their explanations. My restraint was not weakness. It was the beginning of a record that would eventually become harder to ignore than any rumor. His explanation depended on everyone accepting confidence in place of the evidence he had just destroyed. The boxes had been stored in a dry upstairs closet, and I had opened them 2 days before the fire to choose pictures for the memorial. I spoke with people who had no investment in protecting the approved version of events. Their questions were simple and therefore revealing. Who benefited? Who signed? Who had access? What changed afterward? Each answer stripped away another layer of sentiment. The situation became less mysterious as soon as I stopped treating ordinary misconduct as a private misunderstanding no outsider could examine. I kept photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records organized because memory deserved support when the stakes involved my place in the family history. The choice served a larger purpose, preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. The missing albums covered my entire childhood, from hospital photographs to graduations. At the time, I still believed fairness would appear if I explained myself carefully enough. I thought a complete sentence, a clean document, or one honest witness could make people choose decency. The harder lesson was that some people understand perfectly and continue anyway because confusion benefits them. Once I accepted that, my decisions became clearer and much less apologetic. The selection made accident impossible and revealed an intention more intimate than ordinary inheritance greed. Images of Caleb remained in frames throughout the house, while every picture showing me alone or beside Mom disappeared. That was when fear became useful. Instead of letting it circle inside me, I turned it into a checklist. I preserved files, changed passwords, requested certified copies, and wrote down every contact. Action did not eliminate uncertainty, but it gave uncertainty boundaries. Within those boundaries, I could think clearly enough to recognize choices that panic had hidden. Each review of photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records separated a provable fact from another convenient assumption. I measured progress by whether it supported preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. Caleb had spent years telling relatives that I left home at 17 and returned only when Mom became ill. The pattern was familiar. Someone else created the damage, then assigned me responsibility for preventing consequences. Competence had always been used as a reason to demand more from me. I had confused being dependable with being endlessly available. That day forced me to see the difference, and once I saw it, I could no longer return to the role they had prepared for me. The photographs included dates and handwritten notes that quietly contradicted his version. In reality, I attended college 40 minutes away, worked weekends, and later moved back for treatment appointments. The consequence was not immediate, which made the waiting difficult. People who rely on pressure often interpret delay as victory. They become careless, repeat false claims, and commit themselves to details they cannot later reconcile. I let time do that work. Every additional explanation created another point that could be compared with the documents already in my possession. I relied on photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records without asking them to carry emotions they could not measure. For the first time, the path toward preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me felt practical rather than imaginary. At the memorial, Caleb displayed a slideshow in which I appeared only twice, and both images were cropped group pictures. There was nothing cinematic about my response. I went home, opened a notebook, and began arranging what I knew. Dates created a spine. Receipts and messages added weight. Memory supplied context, but I refused to rely on memory alone. I wanted a version of events that would remain true even when affection, embarrassment, and family pressure tried to soften it. Grief kept me seated while strangers accepted a history edited by the person controlling the projector. He introduced himself as the child who stayed and described my caregiving as a recent attempt to repair distance. I began noticing who asked how I was and who asked only what I planned to do. The difference separated concern from strategy. Some people wanted reconciliation before accountability because conflict made them uncomfortable. Others quietly offered dates, copies, or memories that helped. I stopped counting neutrality as kindness. In a dispute built on erasure, refusing to look usually protects the person holding the match. The trail through photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records became a structure strong enough to protect my place in the family history. I did not need certainty about everything. I needed the next action to support preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. Grandma June watched the slideshow without interrupting. People often imagine betrayal as one loud discovery. Mine arrived as a sequence of small contradictions. A changed time, a missing page, a casual sentence that did not match the previous one. Each inconsistency could have been dismissed alone. Together, they formed a design. Recognizing that design was painful, but it also ended the exhausting work of pretending everything might still be accidental. When I said Caleb had already emptied it, she told me some originals had never been there. At 90, she seemed fragile, but her attention remained exact. And afterward, she asked whether I had checked the blue cedar chest in her apartment. Professional advice gave names to behavior I had experienced only as confusion. Misrepresentation, coercion, concealment, retaliation. The words were not magic, but they organized the chaos. Once conduct had a name, it could be answered through a process rather than another circular argument. That shift returned energy I had wasted trying to make unreasonable people admit they were being unreasonable. Whenever explanations shifted, photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records returned the situation to its original shape. The decision made sense because it protected the possibility of preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. Grandma had worked for 40 years in a photography studio and distrusted single copies. I slept badly afterward, replaying every decision that had brought me there. Shame tried to persuade me that I should have predicted the harm sooner. By morning, I understood that trust was not the mistake. The mistake belonged to the person who had treated trust as an unlocked door. That distinction gave me enough steadiness to take the next practical step. What Caleb burned was the most visible collection, not the only record. Whenever Mom mailed prints, Grandma labeled them, stored the negatives separately, and placed duplicates in archival sleeves. I checked the original source whenever possible. Screenshots could be edited, stories polished, and partial documents arranged to create a false impression. Originals carried metadata, handwriting, sequence, and context. The more closely I examined them, the less power the public version held. Truth was not louder, but it was denser. It connected in ways invention could not sustain. I preserved photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records so that exhaustion would never become permission to erase my place in the family history. I kept going with one standard in mind: preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. She gave me a safe deposit key attached to a faded plastic camera charm. The people around me preferred an emotional explanation because emotion could be questioned. Records were less cooperative. A timestamp did not care who was charming. A signature did not become authentic because relatives wanted peace. A financial transfer did not turn into generosity when described at dinner. I began separating what could be proved from what others merely hoped I would accept. Grandma had hidden the originals because Caleb once tore a photograph during an argument and later denied doing it. The box contained 6 sealed envelopes, contact sheets, Super 8 reels, school portraits, and letters Mom had written across 3 decades. My instinct was to protect innocent people from the fallout, even when that protection might also shield the person responsible. I had to distinguish compassion from concealment. Compassion helps someone survive a consequence. Concealment prevents the consequence from arriving. I could offer the first without participating in the second, and that became the line I used in every decision afterward. The evidence in photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records did not need drama. Consistency gave it weight. Even on difficult days, the work returned me to preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. The first envelope held pictures of Mom and me at the county courthouse on the day she finalized my adoption. For years, I had measured strength by how much discomfort I could absorb without inconveniencing anyone. That definition served everyone except me. Real strength, I discovered, sometimes looked like refusing the emergency, declining the invitation, or letting another adult meet the consequence attached to a choice. It felt unnatural at first, because healthy boundaries often feel cruel to people trained by unhealthy expectations. The photographs were not the adoption decree, but the note on the back named the judge and the exact date needed to request it. Caleb had recently suggested to cousins that I was only a foster child who never became legally part of the family. The old version of me would have accepted a private compromise and called it peace. I now understood that secrecy was part of the mechanism. A private settlement without correction would leave the lie available for future use. I did not need public humiliation, but I did need the official record to reflect what happened. Accuracy was not revenge. It was the end of enforced confusion. I learned to trust the connections inside photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records more than anyone's rehearsed certainty. The point was no longer to change another person, but to continue preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. The courthouse archive produced a certified decree showing Mom adopted me at 14 months and granted me the same legal status as Caleb. No single piece of information changed everything. The change came from accumulation. One document supported another. One witness explained a gap. One inconsistency made the next question unavoidable. I stopped asking whether the truth was dramatic enough and focused on whether it was complete. Completeness became my protection against a story designed to survive through exhaustion. His story was not confusion. It was preparation for a claim that the trust's phrase, "children of my body," excluded me. Caleb already knew because his own lawyer had requested the file 2 weeks before the memorial. Small acts of preparation began changing how I carried myself. I stopped flinching at urgent messages. I read documents twice. I asked for requests in writing. The people pressuring me described this as hostility because informality had always favored them. Structure felt aggressive only to those who depended on blurred boundaries. To me, it felt like air entering a room that had been closed for years. With photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records in order, I no longer had to win every conversation to protect my place in the family history. Every boundary became part of preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. Mom's current trust used the broader phrase, "my children," and divided most assets equally. But an amendment gave me the house if I had provided substantial care during her final year. I kept my plans private. The people who had underestimated me were comfortable because they mistook quiet for surrender. They expected either tears they could criticize or anger they could use as proof. I gave them neither. I gave myself time, professional advice, and permission to make decisions without announcing them to anyone who had already shown contempt for my interests. The destroyed photographs included months of dated treatment days, home repairs, and ordinary evenings that showed I had moved in. Caleb argued that I lived elsewhere and visited occasionally. I grieved while I worked. Those activities can exist together. I could miss the person I believed someone was, while protecting myself from the person their choices revealed. I could remember good years without allowing those memories to cancel present evidence. Holding both truths was harder than choosing either denial or hatred, but it left me with a future not organized around resentment. The growing file of photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records allowed the truth to survive moods, loyalties, and delay. That was how an impossible ambition, preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me, became a series of ordinary decisions. Photographs alone could not establish caregiving, so I gathered pharmacy logs, clinic authorizations, grocery receipts, and utility records. The hardest part was not gathering information. It was releasing the fantasy that the right evidence would restore the relationship I thought we had. Evidence could establish facts and shape consequences, but it could not manufacture remorse. Accepting that limitation kept me from bargaining away my safety in exchange for an apology someone offered only when every other option had failed. Each image became a doorway to evidence Caleb assumed had vanished with the smoke. Grandma's albums supplied the timeline that told me where to search and which people had been present. When the pressure increased, I returned to the simplest question: what would I advise a stranger with the same facts? Distance made the answer obvious. I would never tell another woman to surrender records, money, work, or safety merely to prove she loved people who had already used love as leverage. I began offering myself the same basic loyalty I would have offered anyone else. I treated photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records as a map, using each verified detail to decide the next safe step. The outcome remained uncertain, but my direction was not: preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. One contact sheet showed Caleb removing folders from Mom's desk during her final hospitalization. By then, I understood that dignity is rarely recovered through a perfect speech. It returns through repeated choices. I answered only what required an answer. I stopped defending facts that were already documented. I allowed silence to remain in rooms where I had once rushed to make everyone comfortable. The balance of power changed before anyone else was willing to name it. He later claimed Mom had given him the binder months earlier. Grandma had taken the pictures unintentionally while testing an old camera, but the sequence captured him carrying the red trust binder to his car. The turning point came quietly. I realized I was no longer waiting for permission to protect what mattered. Approval from the people benefiting from my silence was never going to arrive. I made the necessary call, signed the necessary form, and accepted that being misunderstood was less dangerous than remaining available for the next violation. What I could establish through photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records mattered more than what pressure asked me to overlook. I allowed the next step to be enough as long as it advanced preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. A letter from Mom to Grandma described pressure Caleb applied for control of the house. What happened next looked sudden to outsiders, but it had been built through years of preparation. Skills gained in ordinary jobs, friendships maintained without advantage, and records kept when no one expected them to matter all converged. The same people who had mistaken patience for passivity discovered that patience can also be a method of becoming impossible to corner. The letter ended with a request that Grandma protect the photographs because Caleb was beginning to rewrite family events. Mom wrote that he wanted to borrow against it for a failing construction company and became furious when she amended the trust. Later, people called the result inevitable. It was not. The result depended on small choices made while I was tired and afraid: keeping a receipt, saving a message, asking one more question, refusing to sign. Justice often looks obvious only after someone has completed the invisible labor of making denial impossible. The discipline of maintaining photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records kept my place in the family history from becoming a bargaining chip. The more accurate the record became, the more possible it felt to continue preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. I hired a probate attorney named Simone Avery and gave her copies rather than the originals. I was tempted to make the outcome personal. A part of me wanted the people who had diminished me to feel exactly what I had felt, but imitation would have kept them at the center of my life. I chose a cleaner form of justice: accurate facts, consistent rules, and consequences I did not need to exaggerate. Reality was sufficient once it was finally allowed into the room. For the first time since Mom died, the dispute moved from rooms he controlled into a process he could not rearrange alone. She requested an immediate inventory, preservation order, and accounting from Caleb as executor. That experience changed my idea of winning. Winning was not watching another person suffer. It was reaching a morning when their choices no longer determined the temperature of my day. It was having work, relationships, and a home that did not require me to shrink. The formal outcome mattered, but freedom was the part no order or judgment could award on my behalf. By following photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records, I could move forward without depending on a confession. I could not control the response, only whether my actions remained aligned with preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. Caleb responded by accusing me of manufacturing sentimental evidence. The next development forced me to separate surprise from disbelief. Surprise passes when new information arrives. Disbelief keeps bargaining with information already present. I had spent too long bargaining. I read the facts in their plainest order and stopped inventing gentler motives simply because the real ones made me uncomfortable. The accusation underestimated a woman who had cataloged 40 years of negatives with dates, chemical notes, and customer numbers. He told relatives Grandma was confused and suggested I had influenced her after the funeral. I created a separate chronology for decisions still ahead. It listed what I knew, what remained uncertain, and which uncertainty actually mattered. The exercise prevented unanswered questions from becoming excuses for inaction. I did not need to solve every mystery before protecting myself from the facts already established. I returned to photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records whenever pressure tried to blur what had happened. That discipline moved me closer to preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. Grandma recorded a formal statement with her own attorney and a geriatric specialist present. I noticed how quickly people reached for my history when they could not answer my evidence. Old mistakes, old loyalties, and old insecurities were introduced as if they changed the current facts. I refused the detour. A person can be imperfect and still be correct about what happened, and I no longer allowed unrelated flaws to become a license for mistreatment. Her calm description made Caleb's claim of sudden manipulation look desperate rather than plausible. She identified her handwriting, storage system, and the reasons she separated original negatives from family prints. The next conversation was shorter because I no longer filled silence with concessions. I stated the necessary point, requested a written response, and ended the exchange. Removing performance from conflict made the remaining issue easier to see. The clearest protection remained in photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records, where confidence could not rewrite sequence. It was one more quiet step toward preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. The executor's accounting exposed 3 transfers from Mom's home equity line to Caleb's company. The situation also revealed the cost of delayed boundaries. Every exception I had made to preserve calm had taught someone that persistence could overcome my refusal. I could not repair that lesson with another explanation. I repaired it by making the boundary predictable, written, and unaffected by the volume of the response. Bank records traced the money to payroll, a truck payment, and overdue commercial rent. He labeled them reimbursements for repairs, but the photographs of the house showed the alleged projects had not occurred. I asked a professional to test my assumptions rather than merely confirm them. Where the evidence was weak, we labeled it weak. Where another explanation remained possible, we preserved that possibility. Careful limits increased credibility and kept me from becoming attached to claims the record could not support. I kept photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records organized because memory deserved support when the stakes involved my place in the family history. The choice served the larger purpose, preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. Caleb's company had been close to collapse for nearly a year. There were days when progress looked like nothing more than not making the wrong call. I did not answer while angry, surrender while tired, or sign while rushed. Those absences were decisions. They created the space in which a better option could remain available long enough for me to recognize it. Erasing my history was part of a financial plan, not merely the cruelty of an angry brother. He expected to refinance Mom's house after gaining control, but the caregiving amendment placed the property beyond his reach. Several documents arrived out of order, but their metadata restored the sequence. Creation dates, account numbers, and version histories exposed revisions that polished narratives had concealed. Details no one expected a reader to notice became anchors for the entire timeline. Each review of photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records separated a provable fact from another convenient assumption. I measured progress by whether it supported preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. Simone obtained the cloud backup from Mom's phone after the court authorized access. I began treating credibility as something demonstrated through behavior rather than claimed through tone. Calm people could lie. Emotional people could tell the truth. The useful question was whether a statement remained consistent with records and later conduct. That standard protected me from charm without requiring me to distrust everyone. Mom's replies were short, increasingly frightened, and consistent with the warning in her letters. Messages showed Caleb asking her to describe me as a tenant instead of a daughter, and threatening to stop visiting if she refused. I made practical plans for more than one outcome. That reduced the power of threats based on uncertainty. If the best result failed, I still had housing, work, support, and a lawful next step. Contingency planning turned fear from a wall into a set of doors. I relied on photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records without asking them to carry emotions they could not measure. For the first time, the path toward preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me felt practical rather than imaginary. The most painful discovery was a video Grandma had transferred from an old tape. As the timeline grew clearer, several memories changed meaning. Comments I had dismissed as jokes now looked like testing. Sudden emergencies looked like rehearsals for later pressure. I resisted the temptation to rewrite every good memory as false. The past was complicated, but complication did not require me to deny the pattern visible in the present. Caleb stood beside me smiling, proof that he had once known belonging was not scarce. It showed my 6th birthday, with Mom explaining that families are made by care and promise before helping both children light candles. The emotional requests intensified as the formal options narrowed. I answered compassionately without changing the underlying position. Kindness did not require inconsistency, and a boundary did not become punishment merely because someone disliked meeting it. The trail through photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records became a structure strong enough to protect my place in the family history. I did not need certainty about everything. I needed the next action to support preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. I considered settling privately to keep the video and letters out of court. The people responsible expected my empathy to weaken my position. They knew I could imagine fear, debt, ambition, and shame from another person's perspective. What they misunderstood was that understanding a motive does not erase agency. I could recognize why someone made a choice and still refuse to carry the consequence. The proposal asked me to trade official truth for property that Mom had already chosen to leave me. Caleb offered to restore half the house value if I accepted his accounting and allowed him to remain executor. One witness remembered a detail everyone else had overlooked. It did not decide the matter alone, but it connected 2 records previously treated as separate. I documented the recollection promptly and let the appropriate process determine its weight. Whenever explanations shifted, photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records returned the situation to its original shape. The decision made sense because it protected the possibility of preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. The probate hearing began with financial records, not photographs. I allowed myself one evening to feel the full insult of it. I did not convert the feeling into a message or decision. I walked, cried, and let anger complete its honest work of showing me where a boundary had been crossed. The next morning, I could act without asking anger to design the outcome. By the time the albums appeared, they supported a pattern already visible through harder evidence. The judge reviewed unauthorized transfers, missing inventories, and Caleb's effort to mortgage an asset before the trust amendment was resolved. I reviewed my own conduct with the same seriousness I expected from others. Where I had made assumptions, I corrected them. Where my language had been sharper than necessary, I acknowledged it. Accountability strengthened my position because it was a practice, not a weapon reserved for opponents. I preserved photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records so that exhaustion would never become permission to erase my place in the family history. I kept going with one standard in mind, preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. Grandma identified the original courthouse photographs and the writing on their backs. Each new fact narrowed the space available for coincidence. The explanation now required too many unrelated accidents, all benefiting the same person and all disadvantaging me. Probability became its own form of clarity. I stopped apologizing for recognizing a pattern that had been carefully created. Caleb's attorney stopped suggesting fabrication and shifted toward arguing that family photographs were emotionally prejudicial. A forensic examiner matched the negatives to the prints and confirmed they predated digital alteration by decades. The official process imposed deadlines that emotion had never respected. Claims required support, responses required consistency, and delay carried defined consequences. Structure did not guarantee justice, but it removed many hiding places. The evidence in photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records did not need drama. Consistency gave it weight. Even on difficult days, the work returned me to preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. The court admitted only images relevant to dates, possession, caregiving, and Caleb's access to documents. I changed my routines before I changed my public position. Access was reviewed, important papers moved, and private conversations limited. These choices looked excessive only if the threat was imaginary. Once the records confirmed intent, basic preparation became an ordinary expression of self-respect. Each photograph answered a specific disputed fact and connected to an independent record. That restraint strengthened the case because the evidence was not presented as a dramatic family scrapbook. I declined invitations to discuss the matter through intermediaries carrying incomplete messages. Triangles had kept our conflicts alive for years. Direct written communication reduced misunderstanding and prevented each person from editing the exchange for a different audience. I learned to trust the connections inside photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records more than anyone's rehearsed certainty. The point was no longer to change another person, but to continue preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. The judge removed Caleb as executor, ordered a full accounting, and froze his share pending restitution. A few people surprised me by telling the truth when doing so offered them no advantage. Their honesty did not solve the dispute, but it reminded me that loyalty and integrity were not opposites. The healthiest support came from people who did not ask me to distort facts in order to prove affection. The house passed to me subject to legitimate estate expenses, exactly as Mom had intended. The unauthorized transfers were referred for investigation, while the caregiving amendment was accepted as valid. Money became easier to discuss once every amount had a source and date. Vague phrases such as family help, shared sacrifice, or business necessity dissolved when compared with transfers and balances. Precision returned moral weight to choices that euphemisms had tried to make harmless. With photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records in order, I no longer had to win every conversation to protect my place in the family history. Every boundary became part of preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. Caleb left the courthouse telling relatives I had weaponized Grandma's memories. The pressure campaign depended on speed. Urgent calls arrived before documents, emotional appeals before complete explanations, and deadlines before independent advice. I slowed every step down. Time was not avoidance. It was the condition required for informed consent. When people saw the loans, the removed binder, and the destroyed albums together, neutrality became harder to perform. Several repeated the phrase until Simone released a concise, factual timeline with permission from the estate. I protected time for ordinary life while the dispute continued. I worked, cooked, slept, and answering friends about subjects unrelated to the crisis. Refusing to let the conflict occupy every hour was not denial. It was practice for the life I intended to have afterward. The growing file of photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records allowed the truth to survive moods, loyalties, and delay. That was how an impossible ambition, preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me, became a series of ordinary decisions. Prosecutors later offered Caleb a restitution agreement tied to the misuse of Mom's credit line. I learned to recognize false balance. One person had acted, another had discovered it, yet observers described both as equally responsible for the conflict. That framing rewarded the original act and punished the refusal to conceal it. I would discuss my response honestly, but I would not accept half the blame for a choice I did not make. Consequences arrived through numbers he could not burn. He avoided jail, but lost his contractor's license for a period and sold equipment to repay the estate. A proposed compromise solved the visible emergency while preserving the mechanism that created it. I rejected it for that reason. A durable solution had to change access, authority, or accountability, not merely postpone the next demand. I treated photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records as a map, using each verified detail to decide the next safe step. The outcome remained uncertain, but my direction was not: preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. Grandma moved into the small apartment above my garage after deciding her building no longer suited her. The truth did not need me to sound invulnerable. I could admit fear, grief, and uncertainty without weakening the facts. In fact, releasing the performance of perfect strength made my decisions more accurate. I asked for help where I needed it, and kept responsibility where it belonged. She corrected names, remembered dresses, and sometimes sat quietly when an image returned someone she had outlived. We spent winter scanning every negative at archival quality and recording her descriptions. I noticed that my body recognized danger before my thoughts admitted it. Tight shoulders, shallow sleep, and the urge to check messages constantly all eased when communication moved into formal channels. Safety became measurable in ordinary physical ways. What I could establish through photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records mattered more than what pressure asked me to overlook. I allowed the next step to be enough, as long as it advanced preserving the truth, without letting the past imprison me. I did not rebuild the family album exactly as it had been. Soon, the dispute reached people who knew none of us personally. Their distance felt frightening at first, then relieving. They were interested in authority, dates, duties, and documents, rather than family roles or social rank. The questions became narrower, and the answers became harder to manipulate. I wanted a record of care as it actually looked, not only the polished moments families choose to display. The old albums centered holidays and posed smiles, while the new archive included hospital parking lots, work badges, bus tickets, and handwritten calendars. The most useful allies did not promise victory. They explained risk, documented options, and told me when my preferred interpretation exceeded the evidence. Their honesty made them trustworthy in a way unconditional agreement never could. The discipline of maintaining photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records kept my place in the family history from becoming a bargaining chip. The more accurate the record became, the more possible it felt to continue preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. The house became a community archive and studio 2 afternoons each month. I stopped rehearsing the speech that would finally make everyone understand. Understanding was not a prerequisite for protection. Some people would continue preferring the version that demanded least from them. My task was to make sure their preference could not control the formal outcome. Children in foster and adoptive families could create duplicate sets, so no single angry person controlled their history. Grandma taught teenagers how to label photographs, store originals, and record the stories behind them. Once the central facts were accepted, the remaining arguments shifted toward intent. I understood why. People often hope a sympathetic motive will cancel an objective act. Motive can shape consequence, but it cannot make an unauthorized signature, transfer, or decision disappear. By following photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records, I could move forward without depending on a confession. I could not control the response, only whether my actions remained aligned with preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. Caleb wrote once asking for copies of photographs showing him with Mom. The emerging consequences were created by the original choices, not by my decision to document them. I repeated that distinction whenever guilt arrived. A smoke alarm does not start the fire, and the person who calls for help does not create the damage responders uncover. I did not give him the originals or access to the archive. I sent digital copies through counsel because the images belonged to the truth, not to my revenge. I prepared for the formal meeting by arranging the story around verified events rather than emotional importance. The most painful moment was not always the legally relevant one. Respecting that difference allowed the decision-maker to see the pattern without being asked to carry my entire grief. I returned to photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records whenever pressure tried to blur what had happened. That discipline moved me closer to preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. Grandma died the following spring with the camera charm beside her bed. For the first time, I could imagine an ending that was not reconciliation or destruction. There was a third possibility: accurate distance. We could occupy the same history without sharing access, and I could release the argument without surrendering the record. I placed the note inside the first archival box. Her final note said, "Photographs cannot prove love, but they can challenge a liar who depends on everyone forgetting." When a fair opportunity for resolution finally appeared, I evaluated it against the future rather than the insult. I asked whether it restored resources, corrected the record, and reduced the chance of repetition. Satisfaction mattered less than stability. The clearest protection remained in photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records, where confidence could not rewrite sequence. It was one more quiet step toward preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. My brother burned every childhood photo he could find because he believed belonging existed only when he controlled the evidence. The result began taking shape through ordinary procedures rather than dramatic revelation. Notices were delivered, accounts reconciled, and statements compared. That quiet machinery mattered because it gave the truth somewhere to go after private appeals had failed. What survived was more than my face on paper. It was a history no longer dependent on his permission. Grandma had hidden the originals, but her greater gift was teaching me to preserve context, not merely images. After the decision, I changed passwords and routines one final time, then stopped checking for new harm every hour. Protection that never allows vigilance to end becomes another kind of captivity. I wanted safeguards strong enough to let attention return to life. I kept photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records organized because memory deserved support when the stakes involved my place in the family history. The choice served a larger purpose, preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. On the archive's first anniversary, I projected the restored birthday film onto the wall where the burned albums had once been stored. I understood then why the earlier version of events had lasted so long. It was emotionally convenient, socially familiar, and expensive to challenge. Truth required work from people who had benefited from not looking. I could not perform all of that work for them, but I could refuse to finance the lie with my silence. The picture flickered, steadied, and remained. I watched my mother place one hand on each child's shoulder and saw the family we had been before fear and money narrowed Caleb's memory. The first peaceful week felt strangely empty. I had become accustomed to using every spare thought for preparation. Gradually, the empty space filled with work, friendship, and plans that had no connection to the dispute. That was recovery becoming visible. Each review of photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records separated a provable fact from another convenient assumption. I measured progress by whether it supported preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me. I did not leave the experience unchanged. I became slower to confuse familiarity with safety and less willing to treat urgency as authority. That was not cynicism. It was the discipline of making room for facts before surrendering my place in the family history. The official record eventually became shorter than the years leading to it. A few pages contained dates, findings, and consequences. What those pages could not show was the private work required to stop organizing my life around my brother Caleb. People sometimes asked whether I felt vindicated. The word suggested a single, satisfying moment, but recovery was quieter. It arrived when I could think about the future without first calculating how my brother Caleb might react. I kept copies of photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records in one secure place and stopped carrying them through every ordinary day. Evidence had completed its job. I was allowed to build a life in which protection existed without constant vigilance. In the end, preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me required more courage than any public confrontation. It meant refusing to become a mirror of the behavior that hurt me. I could insist on consequence without making cruelty my inheritance. The people who had watched from a distance preferred to describe the ending as a reversal of fortune. That description missed the years of work between injury and consequence. Nothing had turned by magic. I had simply stopped donating my silence, labor, and doubt to a version of events that protected my brother Caleb. I also learned that an accurate ending does not require every relationship to be repaired. Some connections became smaller, some disappeared, and a few became more honest after access was no longer automatic. Loss remained loss, but it no longer had authority over my place in the family history. Looking back, the decisive moments were rarely the loudest ones. They were the mornings when I preserved one more file, asked for one more explanation in writing, or declined to solve a crisis I had not created. Those choices accumulated until preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me was no longer an idea, but the shape of my daily life. I did not tell the story to prove that patience always wins. Patience without action can become permission. What protected me was patient action, checking photographs, negatives, letters, and trust records, seeking advice, and choosing a response that would still make sense after the immediate anger passed. There are parts of the experience I still dislike remembering. Healing did not turn betrayal into a useful gift, and success did not make the original harm necessary. I grew because I worked to recover, not because my brother Caleb secretly taught me a lesson I should be grateful to receive. The future became ordinary again in the best possible way. I made plans without building them around another person's emergency. I spent time with people who could hear no without treating it as abandonment. The protection of my place in the family history stopped feeling like a battle and became part of how I lived. If I had one truth to give the person I was at the beginning, it would be this: evidence is not cold, boundaries are not cruelty, and refusing to carry another adult's consequence is not revenge. Those tools made room for preserving the truth without letting the past imprison me when promises and apologies could not. Eventually, I could hold the whole history without needing to change its ending in my imagination. The facts were established, the consequence belonged where it fell, and my attention was free to move elsewhere. That freedom was the outcome I had wanted long before I knew how to name it. Time did not erase what happened, but it changed the scale. What once filled every thought became one completed part of a much larger life. I could remember my brother Caleb without immediately returning to the moment when my place in the family history seemed most vulnerable.